216 plus. That's how many religious denominations exist within the United States today. Protestant, Evangelical Protestant, Catholic, and 20 identified others. And the fastest growing group? None of the above. Not only the fastest, but the only consistently growing group, as shown through a 2019 Gallup poll, is the group that includes atheists, agnostics, and humanists, which grew from 14.3 million Americans in 1990 to 68.9 million in 2019. If there was ever an important time to revisit the concept of separation of church and state, that time is now. Let's first add the historical decision to create that separation, then subtract its evolution over time, and finally, balance the problem with a demand for a return to a representative government that does not engage in religious discrimination nor work to garner religious favor. From the beginning, people immigrated to the colony seeking religious freedom. Because of their belief in the separation of church and state, according to the Legal Information Institute in September of 2020, the framers of the U.S. Constitution and the members of the Constitutional Convention agreed that government should have no power to influence its citizens toward or away from religion. The Constitution disallows any religious test as requisite for public service, and the First Amendment states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the exercise thereof religion. So Congress is prohibited from adopting any particular religion or interfering with an individual's exercise of religion. Now, there are those who want to argue the founders' intent. Thomas Jefferson and Religious Freedom, courtesy of the Thomas Jefferson Encyclopedia, says Jefferson explained to Benjamin Rush that he had sworn eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man, and that religious freedom and a strict separation of church and state were the only way to defend against the dangerous aristocracy of kings and priests. Furthermore, he voiced pragmatic concerns for minority religious groups that did not want to be under the power or influence of a national religion. James Madison wrote that religion is essentially distinct from civil government. A connection between them is injurious to both. And Thomas Paine put it succinctly, saying, persecution is always the strongly marked feature of all religions established by law. But now, we must subtract the evolution of that separation. It started slowly, at least as far as those sitting in the Oval Office were concerned, and was publicly supported through spoken and written arguments from Andrew Jackson and Ulysses S. Grant, to Teddy Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, and Jimmy Carter. But there, the evolutionary wheel begins to spin more rapidly. To analyze the beginning of the erosion of this founding principle, let's look at the hypocrisy of Reagan's church and state quote from the secular left, which aired for the first time as a podcast on April 4th, 2020. The statement in question is a single line taken from a lengthy speech delivered at Temple Hill in New York in 1984. We command no worship. We mandate no belief. Church and state are and must remain separate. However, in the same address, Ronald Reagan asks the Supreme Court to overturn a decision that was actually made by the Connecticut court, specifically aimed at protecting the sanctity of the separation of church and state. In the podcast, Anne Graham says, "This is the true beginning of a politician seeming to support the separation of church and state, but only when it helps or supports the religion that he agrees with." In Social Sciences Inquiry magazine, Volume 2, 2010, Bridget Volochinsky writes that the presidency of George W. Bush undermined the separation of church and state. Just 9 days after his inauguration, she writes, President Bush introduced a major public policy called Faith-Based Initiative. With executive orders, he essentially helped religious organizations overcome government's bureaucratic obstacles to funding, ordered FEMA to revise their policy on emergency relief to include religious organizations, and implemented a government program to produce a guidebook explaining how faith-based organizations could apply for federal grants. And the list goes on. Bush's evangelical leanings also increased the rigidity of policies regarding abstinence teaching, access to abortion, stem cell research, and same-sex marriage. Volochinsky writes, "The U.S. Constitution mandates a degree of separation between church and state in order to prevent an alliance between religious interests and government, in order to prevent harm from this great nation. President Bush strengthened this alliance, and that was a dangerous step." Now, let's regain our balance and steady the perilous ground on which we find ourselves today to arrive at a new equation. You see, Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush may have opened the door to evangelical influence on government, but under Donald Trump, the separation of church and state eroded to a tipping point. According to 3 law professors in The Atlantic on June 29, 2020, the past few months have seen a near complete collapse of this principle with respect to the government funding of religion. Under the Paycheck Protection Program, which had, at that point, allocated $699 billion in subsidies to support small businesses during the pandemic, the government extended funding to churches in unprecedented amounts. The PPP rules were specific to protecting small businesses and nonprofits, but that rule was waived by the Small Business Administration under Trump, and many religious organizations received hundreds of millions, likely billions, in PPP loans. Meanwhile, secular nonprofits such as Boys and Girls Club and others are not eligible for the same exemption. Worse yet, we learned as detailed reports finally emerged in November that Joel Osteen's megachurch received $4.4 million according to federal data, one of the largest approved for any Texas-based entity. And this is the same church that has received a great deal of public scrutiny for their refusal to open their church doors to help those displaced during natural disasters, such as Hurricane Harvey in 2017. The Trump administration's misuse of religious freedom to harm others has been unprecedented, said Rachel Laser, CEO and president of Americans United. The Trump administration corrupted the concept of religious freedom, using it to sanction discrimination, deny access to health care, and require taxpayers to fund religion. In an article in Global Baptist News on November 11, 2020, the AU called on the incoming Biden-Harris administration to right the wrongs of the Trump administration and build a better future. That future is one that values religious freedom and equality for all, by repealing the Muslim ban, because no one should be denied entry to our country based on someone else's religion. By signing an executive order to restore and protect religious freedom for all Americans, ensuring that Americans are not denied health care based on someone else's religion, specifically to overturn Trump's denial of care rule that protects the religious beliefs of care providers over access to care for everyone equally, by supporting the Do No Harm Act that would prohibit the constitutional right for minority leaders' religions to freely exercise their beliefs, funding only public schools with public school funds, and enforcing the Johnson Amendment tax code that prohibits religious entities from endorsing or opposing political candidates. We, too, must demand that the government reflect the nation's religious diversity and the nomination of federal judges who respect the separation of church and state. We cannot allow this important principle of the American foundation to continue to erode. There's more clarity to the founders' intent than 2 of the last 3 administrations would have had us believe. And hopefully, some of the damage done to religious freedom can be corrected before it is too late. As the First Amendment tells us, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the exercise thereof. Let us demand that Congress shall make no law that uses taxpayer dollars to cover the churches in their tax-exempt status. And for the 216 recognized religions in the U.S., it shall guarantee each and every one of us the right to believe and worship as we choose. Or, like 68.9 million of us, not to.